For today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Pacific Rim Uprising, the long-awaited sequel to the 2013 movie Pacific Rim. And let's talk about the production history behind Pacific Rim Uprising, shall we? Because it almost looked like the movie was never gonna happen. Because back when the first Pacific Rim movie came out, it came out the same weekend as Grown Ups 2, and between the two movies, Grown Ups 2 made more money than Pacific Rim. And even though Pacific Rim was considered to be the highest grossing movie within Guillermo del Toro's filmography, box office wise it was considered to be a bomb, domestically speaking, because on one hand, the movie did make a lot of money overseas. And there's kind of this question going around, it's like, will there be a Pacific Rim sequel? Because of the box office. And there are just several articles floating around where it's like, will Pacific Rim happen or will it not happen? And sure enough, it did happen. It just doesn't have Guillermo del Toro behind the director's chair because the production of the movie took too long to get going. And Guillermo del Toro at that point in time decided to direct the 2017 movie The Shape of Water, but he was still producer for Pacific Rim Uprising, while Stephen S. DeKnight took over directing duties for Pacific Rim Uprising. And this is the first movie that the director has ever, directed, because before this, he was primarily known for being a screenwriter and a producer on various TV shows, ranging from Spartacus, the Starz TV series, to becoming the showrunner for Marvel's Daredevil Netflix series after the departure of Drew Goddard. And much like Guillermo del Toro before him, Stephen S. DeKnight said in an interview that he grew up on various tokusatsu-related TV shows ranging from Ultraman, Space Giants, and more obviously the Godzilla franchise, so it looked like the movie was going to be in good hands. However, once the advertising for the movie started to come out, people had mixed results, because you had the one group of people who were like, okay, I'm not the biggest fan of the advertising, but I'm just happy that the movie is even coming out at all, while the other half of it were disappointed because they didn't like the direction it was going and thought the movie was going to be crap because Guillermo del Toro wasn't behind the director's chair. Which leads into my big question for the movie. Was it worth waiting for a Pacific Rim sequel after all these years? As for the plot of the movie, 10 years after the events of the first Pacific Rim, the once promising Jaeger pilot Jake Pentecost now lives the life of luxury while taking part in a criminal underworld. Soon, he, along with a Jaeger hacker, get captured by the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps, only to be recruited by Jake's estranged sister, Mako Mori, along with Jake's former Jaeger pilot, Nate. Sometime later, the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps holds a council meeting whether or not they want to scrap human-piloted Jaegers in favor of mass-produced drone Jaegers. And as the council meeting progresses, a rogue Jaeger in the form of Obsidian Fury soon shows up wreaking havoc, forcing Jake and Nate to pilot the new Jaeger Gypsy Avenger in order to fight against the rogue Jaeger. Meanwhile, other members of the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps soon uncover a conspiracy revolved around the mass-produced Jaegers. Can the next generation of Jaeger pilots uncover the mystery behind the mass-produced Jaegers? Or will the mastermind behind the conspiracy succeed and kickstart a new war on mankind in order to take over Earth itself? In terms of what I liked about the movie, I think that the special effects in this movie are fantastic and really pretty to look at. Sure, I do think that some of the metal plating on Gypsy Avenger from time to time could be more polished, but I do think that the CGI and the green screen effects in this movie look really good, regardless if the CGI is used on the new lineup of Jaegers and Kaiju in terms of body movement or textures, regardless if it's the metal plating on a Jaeger or the rough hide on a Kaiju. And on top of that, I think that the green screen effects in terms of how it's used to integrate the human cast with the green screen environment, like the Jaeger hangar of the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps' Jaeger Academy, blend together very nicely. Another aspect of the movie I liked was the battles themselves, because the biggest problem I had with the battles in the first Pacific Rim movie, most of them took place at night, either in or around water. This here, a lot of the battles take place during the day inside the city. And I think that's what a lot of people wanted to see from the first Pacific Rim movie, where we wanted to see more city destruction as opposed to to having battles that take place in water. I mean, with the first Pacific Rim movie, I think there's like 1 to 2 battles that take place in the city, but most of them take place in water. This one here, almost all of them exclusively take place in the city, with the exception of the second battle between Gypsy Avenger and Obsidian Fury, where they fight in the Siberian tundra. But other than that, I like the fact that most of the battles take place during the day, where you can see a lot more detail, and there's a lot more city destruction scenes. I also really like the designs to the Jaegers in the movie. Sure, I don't think they're as creative looking as the Jaegers seen in the first Pacific Rim movie, but they get the job done. And within the context of this universe, I think it makes a lot of sense as to why some of the Jaegers in this movie don't look as visually interesting as the ones featured in the previous movie. Because with the first Pacific Rim movie, of the 4 Jaegers, you had Gypsy Danger and Striker Eureka, which looked the most human of the bunch, but then you had the other 2 Jaegers, Cherno Alpha and Crimson Typhoon, which still maintain a humanoid-looking appearance, but they had very monstrous features. Like, Crimson Typhoon had a cycloptic eye with 3 arms, whereas Cherno Alpha had these huge fists and had like this really thick upper body. And between the 4 Jaegers, the Jaegers that had the most monstrous looking appearance, like Cherno Alpha and Crimson Typhoon, were the ones that were taken out pretty quickly, whereas the more humanoid looking Jaegers like Gypsy and Striker were the ones that lasted the longest. So I think it makes a lot of sense that a lot of the Jaegers featured within this movie have a more humanoid appearance to them. And on top of that, I think the filmmakers were trying to add real world logic to the Jaegers in some case, because if you look at a lot of humanoid robots back in the 90s, they were very big and bulky and didn't quite look human. But over time, because of how advanced robotics has become, a modern day humanoid looking robot isn't as big or bulky and actually does have a more humanoid looking appearance. Then you have the Jaeger designs themselves, starting with Gypsy Avenger, which is this more up-to-date version of Gypsy Danger, in that sense where it's a lot sleeker and a lot more mobile than Gypsy Danger, but still maintains a lot of the same visual motifs like the yellow visor, the dark blue color scheme, along with the blade arms. As far as the other Jaegers go, I'll break it down to the Jaegers that assist Gypsy Avenger at the end of the movie, followed by the Rogue Jaeger, the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, and then maybe some of the more miscellaneous Jaegers. But anywho, as for the 3 Jaegers that assist Gypsy Avenger at the end of the movie, I feel like all 3 of these Jaegers were either based off like ancient warriors or some kind of up-to-date human in some shape or form. Because when you look at Saber Athena, the orange Gundam-esque like Jaeger, its body movement and fighting style reminds me a lot of the fighting style to that of a Shaolin monk in terms of how fluid its body movement is, and even using 2 sword-like weapons. As for Guardian Bravo, the maroon white colored Jaeger, its overall body design and weapon of choice are very reminiscent to that of a Rajput warrior, while Bracer Phoenix design is very reminiscent to that of a football player, which I really dig. Moving on to the black Rogue Jaeger Obsidian Fury, it has this cool black sleek design with some orange highlights seen throughout its body structure, and it's basically the evil version of Gypsy Avenger, as it is seen using similar weapons. Then you have the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, which have this really awesome looking design, because back when Pacific Rim Uprising was still in development hell, there was a rumor going around that the movie was going to feature a Kaiju Jaeger hybrid, and originally I thought what they were going to do was maybe take like one of the corpses of the dead Kaiju from the first movie, like Leatherback, and bring it back to life using Jaeger technology in the same vein as something like Mecha-King Ghidorah from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. But the direction they went with the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids is actually really awesome in terms of their physical appearance, where they're bright white with exaggerated claw-like features and spikes with blue highlights. And I actually do think that the Jaegers themselves are meant to be an obvious homage to the likes of the 13th Angel and the mass-produced Evangelion units from the Neon Genesis Evangelion franchise. Then you got some of the minor Jaegers like November Ajax, which is this cycloptic light blue sleek Jaeger, followed by Valor Omega, which is this big, bulky, tank-like Jaeger that's armed to the teeth with weapons, which is, I think, meant to be more of like a upgraded version of the Mach 2 Jaeger Coyote Tango from the first Pacific Rim movie. as for the overall design aesthetic to the kaiju that appear in this movie, it's very different in contrast to the kaiju that appeared in the first Pacific Rim movie, because with the first Pacific Rim movie, most of those kaijus were modeled after real-life animals. Like, you had Knifehead that was modeled after a goblin shark, Leatherback that was modeled after a gorilla, Raiju that was modeled after a crocodile, and Obiharu that was modeled after a crab of some sort. As for the design aesthetics for the kaiju that appear in this movie, they go in a different direction, since the kaiju, instead of being modeled after real-life animals, I think the director purposely made the kaiju over the top, in the same vein as the type of kaiju that you would see in tokusatsu TV shows like Ultraman or Zone Fighter. Case in point, with the Category 5 kaiju, Raijin, it doesn't look like any animal that we know in the real world. If anything, it kind of reminds me of the Xenomorph Queen from the Alien franchise, if it was more jacked up and had a Venus flytrap looking face. As for the designs of the two Category 4 kaiju that accompany Raijin, Haikuja's overall design, even though I don't think it was based on any pre-existing animal, kind of reminds me of a cross between a lizard, a centipede, and has some elements of that of a hammerhead shark. As for the other Category 4 kaiju, Spikethorn, of the three new kaiju that appear in this movie, this design is probably my least favorite because it just feels too familiar in that sense of its design looks like a cross between Leatherback and Slattern from the previous Pacific Rim movie. That being said, I still do remember the design of this kaiju. Then you have the design of the Mega-Kaiju, which is actually pretty neat because it's just a fusion of the previous three kaiju merged together, where it has like the general body structure of Spikethorn, but has like the mandibles, the multi-limbs, and the spikes of Haikuja, but it has like the general muscle build, powers, and level of aggression of Raijin, which I thought was pretty cool. And I will be talking about the Mega-Kaiju sometime later in the review, but for now I actually do like the overall design of the Mega-Kaiju itself. Another aspect of the movie that I liked was the movie's cinematography, because I thought the movie looked nice and was shot very well. And it does continue some of the type of shots and angles that you'd see in the first movie, where we have a lot of tilted shots, either looking up at the Jaegers or looking down from the Jaegers' point of view. I also think that the movie has some really good production values other than the CGI and the cinematography. Like, the set designs I think are designed nicely. The practical effects used are also pretty good, along with the costumes, with the exception of the Jaeger uniforms that you see the characters wear throughout the movie, but I'll talk about that later. I also think that the movie's overall color scheme is a good reflection and complements the tone that this movie has going for it, much like how the color scheme and the tone complement each other in the first Pacific Rim movie, because with the first Pacific Rim movie, it's very colorful to look at, but has this dark and gritty edge to it that really embraces the overall downbeat nature of the first movie. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, it's very colorful to look at, but instead of having a dark and gritty edge to it, it's more lively and energetic to look at that really embraces the overall upbeat nature of this movie. Another aspect of the movie that I liked was the fact that we have a Jaeger versus Jaeger battle, because I think one of the things that people really wanted to see in this movie was not just a battle between Jaegers and the Kaiju, but a battle between Jaegers as well, because that would have added a new element to the movie, in which it does. But I think the main reason as to why I like the Jaeger battle between Gypsy Avenger and Obsidian Fury is the fact that this is something I wanted to see for a long time, at least in any movie. Because when people think of movies about giant robots fighting each other, they're primarily thinking of the Michael Bay Transformer movies. But the thing is, those movies focus on alien robots that are big, but they're not like skyscraper sized. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, we do indeed get a battle between two skyscraper sized robots piloted by people duking it out. Because when you really sit down and think about it, the idea of giant skyscraper sized robots fighting each other is a popular idea that's been done a lot in the realm of animation, but not so much in the live action media, because in the past 50 or 100 years of live action cinema, how many movies other than Pacific Rim feature legit giant robot battles? For me, I can only think of one, that being the 1980s cult movie Robot Jocks. Like, you would think there would be more movies focused on this topic. Granted, we are in the middle of a giant monster boom at the moment, so who knows? Maybe this will give birth to a new wave of giant robot movies, but only time will tell. And in some ways, I do think that Pacific Rim is a much better Power Rangers movie than the actual Power Rangers movie that came out in 2017, in a sense of its tone and visual aesthetics. Because with the 2017 Power Rangers movie, it was following the heels of The Dark Knight, where it took this idea that was inherently silly and tried to do a serious take on it by becoming more realistic. And as far as the design aesthetic goes, everything from the Power Ranger suits, the monster designs, along with the Megazord designs, looked terrible. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, even though I did talk about the movie's tone and design aesthetics a tad bit earlier in the movie review, as a quick recap, totally this movie's a lot more upbeat and embraces its more outlandish concepts that come with this type of story. As for the visual aesthetics, everything between the Jaeger designs, the Kaiju designs, along with the costumes that the Jaeger pilots are seen wearing while operating the Jaegers, visually look great in comparison to the visual aesthetics featured in the 2017 Power Rangers movie. Albeit, as I mentioned before, I do have problem with the overall design of the Jaeger suits that I'll talk about later. Hell, even the way the main villain creates their giant monster I thought was handled better here than with the 2017 Power Rangers movie, because with the 2017 Power Rangers movie, the main villain, Rita Repulsa, spends a good chunk of the movie gathering gold in order to create her loyal servant, Goldar. But the way it's done, it's very uncreative, where the gold just starts out as being this liquid metal that just kind of forms together to create Goldar. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, during the final battle where we have our heroes battling the three Kaiju, the main villain unleashes this legion of nanomites that head straight towards the three Kaiju in question and begin to combine the three Kaiju against their wills to form the Mega-Kaiju. And it's actually done both a cool and disturbing way, because when you see the three Kaiju merge together, this like red mist appears, so you really don't get a sense of like how they merge together. And as they're merging together, you have this really creepy music playing in the background. But what makes this transformation sequence disturbing is a combination of the weird sounds and noises that occur as the Kaiju merge together, and on top of that, the Kaiju are forced to merge together against their own will. Because you have to keep in mind, the three Kaiju in question are three separate characters in and of themselves, and by having the main villain combine the three together, not only does it take away their personalities, but it also takes away their free will. And when you sit down and think about it, that's pretty screwed up. Probably more screwed up than having Rita Repulsa stealing gold from people in order to create Goldar. Although there is one element that the 2017 Power Rangers movie did better than Pacific Rim Uprising, that being the characterization of the teenagers. Because with the teenage cast of Pacific Rim Uprising, I found a lot of the teenagers to be either underdeveloped or weren't that interesting to begin with the exception of Amara, because she is one of the main characters of the movie and we get to know her the most of the teenage cast. But other than Amara, the other teenagers fall flat. With the teenage cast of the 2017 Power Rangers movie, on the other hand, that group of teenagers were a lot more developed. We get to know each of their backstories. We even see the type of personality and mannerisms each of them have, and they feel more authentic as a group of teenagers in comparison to the teenage cast of Pacific Rim Uprising, which feel more like a stereotype of teenagers, whereas the cast of the Power Rangers movie actually feel like teenagers. Another aspect of the movie that I liked was the virtual holograms within the Jaeger cockpit, because with the first Pacific Rim movie, anytime you focus on the action sequences, here's how they're usually set up. We cut back and forth between what's going on inside the Jaeger cockpit and seeing the actual Jaeger battling the Kaiju. Because at the back of my mind, I know for a fact that these Jaeger pilots are indeed inside this Jaeger battling this Kaiju, but the way it's presented, there's this sort of weird disconnect where it doesn't really feel like the Jaeger pilots are actually authentically there battling the Kaiju. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, by adding the holographic projection within the Jaeger cockpit itself, it makes the action sequences more complete when we do cut back and forth between the physical battle itself along with what's going on inside of the Jaeger cockpit. Because when you do see the Jaeger pilots interacting with the holographic projections of the missiles from Obsidian Obsidian Fury or the Kaiju, I do get this sense that the Jaeger pilots are actually taking part in the battle itself. As for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the Mega-Kaiju as a whole. Because on one hand, I think it's really cool to see 3 separate kaiju merge together to form this Mega-Kaiju during the climax. For 2 reasons. One, it adds something new to the Pacific Rim franchise. Second, I've always seen this idea of a bunch of smaller characters forming into one larger character, either seen within the realm of animation done in TV shows like Transformers or Voltron, or if I have seen it in the live action medium, I've usually seen it with like the Super Sentai or Power Ranger TV shows. But here's the thing, those are usually done with characters that are either robot in nature or characters piloting robots. With the Mega-Kaiju, on the other hand, it kind of subverts that trope where instead of having several Jaegers form together, it's instead the kaiju that form together to form this massive Mega-Kaiju, which I think is really cool. However, I do have a problem with the Mega-Kaiju as a whole. I think that instead of being a fusion of Raijin, Haikuja, and Spikethorn, I think the Mega-Kaiju should have been its own character, separate from those 3 kaiju altogether. Because as it is, the climax to this movie is almost similar to the climax to the first Pacific Rim movie, where we have a couple Jaegers battling 3 different kaiju. Granted, there is a lot of differences between each battle, and the way they conclude is completely different, but I think it would have been a lot cooler if, instead of having this battle start out with 3 kaiju that merge together to form one, I think it would have been a lot cooler if we had 4 Jaegers battling one gigantic kaiju from the get-go, and instead calling the Mega-Kaiju, I think it should have been called the DeKnight. In terms of what I disliked about the movie's sense of humor is hit and miss. Because there are some points in time that I found to be mildly funny, but the rest of the jokes in the movie I thought were really forced and unnecessary. Although there was one joke that made me cringe when I watched the movie, that being when one of the characters in the movie decides to play the Trollolol song, because one, they're really playing that song in the movie, and second, it's being played during a part of the movie where you have this really epic scene happening, where you have like all the Jaegers strapped to rockets, flying towards Tokyo to battle the kaiju, like essentially the calm before the storm. So at this point in time, you would expect there to be like this music to build up the momentum. But no, once one of the pilots starts playing the Trollolol song, it plays throughout that sequence until we actually do get to Tokyo, where the kaiju are on a rampage. Another thing that I disliked about this movie was the way the story was handled. Because with the first Pacific Rim movie, within the first 5 minutes, we are told what the premise to the movie is, we learn the terminology, we get introduced to certain key characters, and through those 5 minutes, it shows us everything in terms of how the Kaiju War started, how it progressed, and for the rest of the movie, it focuses on the final days of the Kaiju War. And through this premise, it's the main driving force of the story. Because in between the kaiju attacks, we focus on the main cast of characters in their downtime when there isn't a kaiju attack. But the thing is, during these moments in time, there's a sense of dread felt throughout the whole movie because the characters are always constantly anticipating the next attack because of the looming threat of the kaiju, since a kaiju could appear out of nowhere and attack at any moment. And sure enough, during the middle of the movie, when a pair of kaiju do show up, shit hits the fan. And on top of that, the cast of characters were handled a lot better in the first Pacific Rim movie because we learned who the main characters are, how they interact with people, what their backstory is, what motivates them, and some of these characters go through a story arc in some shape or form. With Pacific Rim Uprising, on the other hand, we get none of that, because within the first 5 minutes of this movie, instead of establishing what the main premise of the movie is, it throws out an idea in which we think could be the main premise, but sweeps it on the rug in favor of some other plot thread. The world building is barely there, and we focus more on who our main hero is and how he survives in this post-kaiju war world. And after those 5 minutes, stuff just happens. Like, I really don't think the plot of the movie kicks in until maybe sometime either during or after Obsidian Fury's first major appearance. But even then, there was really no driving force to this movie. It's just stuff happens. And as far as the characters go, we barely get to know the characters. We get vague backstories. We don't learn their motivations, and they don't go through any character arcs. Or if they have a character arc, it happened sometime before the events of this movie. Another problem I had with the movie was the fact that the movie did some retreaded moments. Granted, the context behind them is slightly different from one scene to another, but the concept behind the idea is still there. Like the fact that the main character used to be a part of the Jaeger program at some point, but then some high-ranking officer offers them a job back in the Jaeger program, and there's a point in time where the main character does a test drift with one of the new cadets, and we have a flashback sequence that's very reminiscent of Mako Mori's drifting sequence from the first movie. Another problem I have with the movie is the way the story is structured along with the concepts introduced. Because on one hand, I do think that the concepts of having a rogue Jaeger along with Kaiju Jaeger hybrids I think are really cool, but I think they're really underutilized here because if I had to break this movie down in thirds, first third of the movie is primarily focused on the rogue Jaeger. The middle of the movie is focused on the K-Jaegers, while the last third of the movie is focused on the Kaiju. It almost seems like the filmmakers had a couple different ideas, and they had one idea featuring nothing but the rogue Jaeger and the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, but then they remembered people liked the first movie because it featured giant robots versus giant monsters. So it almost seemed like the reintroduction of the Kaiju in this movie was last minute, and or the way they were reintroduced felt very contrived in order to satisfy the people who liked the first one because it was a simple giant robot versus giant monster story. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the Jaeger pilot suits for this movie because when you look at the Jaeger pilot suits in the previous movie, those particular suits had one of two things going for them. From an aesthetic point of view, they looked great, depending on what Jaeger the Jaeger pilots were operating, and they looked like they actually function as intended. With the Jaeger pilot suits in this movie, they take a huge step back because they don't look like they truly function as intended, and from a visual aesthetic point of view, they don't really look like official Jaeger uniforms that the military would design. They almost look like something a cosplayer would design as opposed to an actual military organization. Also, what happened to some of the other characters? Because characters like Mako Mori, Dr. Herman, along with Dr. Newt make a return, but characters like Raleigh Beckett, Hercules Hansen, along with Tendo don't make a return. Hell, they're not even name dropped, so we have no idea why those characters aren't back. I also didn't like the way the cast of characters defeated the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, because the characters essentially pull a Star Wars Phantom Menace style plan of defeating these Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, and it's just one of those things where that plan and idea and execution is a very overdone trope within a science fiction movie like this. Another thing that I disliked about the movie was the plot twist revolved around the person responsible for many of the events that occur throughout the movie, because when the plot twist is revealed, not only is it stupid, but it just doesn't make any sense in the grand scheme of things. Like, it'd be one thing if this character was paranoid and they did what they did, which led to the events of this movie, but the explanation that's given here was just really incredibly stupid. I think it could have been handled in a much better way. Although, there is one thing I find funny about this plot twist. I already knew about this plot twist ahead of time, not because of the advertising or people spoiling the plot twist online. I actually knew about this plot twist 2 years after the release of the original Pacific Rim, because Pacific Rim Uprising, when it was still called Pacific Rim Maelstrom, was in development hell. I don't remember if it was Guillermo del Toro or one of the actors, but one of them revealed what would have happened to one of the characters in the sequel, and they revealed this idea, which eventually became the plot twist to this movie. I also didn't really like the way the movie utilized Mako Mori in this movie, because in the first Pacific Rim movie, my biggest gripe with the character cast was the fact that I really didn't like Riley Beckett as the main character because I didn't think he was all that interesting, and I think that Mako Mori should have been the main character because she's the one that has the interesting backstory and the one that actually goes through a character arc in that movie. With Mako Mori in this movie, on the other hand, she's not a main character, she's not even a support cast. She's just some one-off character that becomes the new Bryan Cranston of the 2014 Godzilla movie, where she appears for the first 45 minutes, but then disappears for the remainder of the movie. Which is a shame, because I feel like they could have done a lot with this character if they made Mako Mori the main character of this movie. Where on one hand, she could have been like, where's Riley Beckett? Because maybe in this universe, maybe he disappeared, and as she's looking for Riley Beckett, she somehow discovers that Stacker Pentecost had a legit son that he didn't know about in the form of Jake Pentecost. She tries to form a brother-sisterly bond with Jake Pentecost over the course of the movie. As it is, I do feel that Mako Mori's role in this movie was a missed opportunity. Another problem that I had with the movie is the overall screen time that the Kaiju and Jaegers get in the movie, because if you're someone who's expecting a lot of Kaiju action, don't, because the Kaiju themselves don't appear until like the last 15 or 20 minutes of the movie, which will disappoint some people. And as far as the Jaegers go, Gypsy Avenger gets the most amount of screen time since it's the main hero Jaeger that we follow throughout the whole movie, which makes sense to me. And as far as the new lineup of Jaegers go, ranging from Saber Athena, Bracer Phoenix, and Guardian Bravo, despite the movie heavily advertising these new Jaegers, this lineup of Jaegers, much like the Kaiju, don't appear until the last 15 to 20 minutes of the movie. I mean, sure, we get some brief glimpses of them throughout the movie, but they don't get activated until like the last 15 to 20 minutes, as I said before. Which is really disappointing because you spend all this advertising showing off these new Jaegers, but they barely appear in the movie as it is. And I feel that this group of Jaegers could have appeared earlier in the movie. For example, during the Kaiju Jaeger hybrid assault, I think that Jake, Nate, and the cadets should have gotten into these Jaegers and then begin to battle the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids before battling the Kaijus themselves. Instead, we see the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids not just destroying the base, but also tear apart miscellaneous Jaegers left and right. And speaking of the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids, much like the Jaegers before them, the movie advertises the fact that the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids are going to be a major part of the movie, but the Kaiju Jaeger hybrids themselves only appear for one action sequence and then get destroyed. And last but not least, the Rogue Jaeger Obsidian Fury I feel was very underutilized within the movie. Because in the advertising for this movie, it looks like Obsidian Fury is going to be a reoccurring antagonist for our heroes, but the role in which Obsidian Fury plays in the movie is less of a reoccurring antagonist and more reminiscent of that of Bryan Cranston's character from the 2014 Godzilla movie, where it primarily appears in the first third of the movie, but then disappears after that, focusing on some of the other aspects of the story. Another problem that I had with the movie has to do with the way certain characters end up in Siberia, of all places. Because sometime during Obsidian Fury's first rampage, one of the characters discovers that the Rogue Jaeger is emitting this weird signal, and this character copies said signal and sends it back to their comrades. And when the main cast of characters decipher the message, they misinterpret it, because when they first decode this character's message, they think that the character was saying there's a new kaiju on the loose, because the image itself looks like a dragon kaiju type creature. And you have one of the characters go, does it match any known kaiju within the database? And sure enough, it doesn't match any known kaiju within the database. But sometime later, one of the characters admits they misinterpreted the message, and the character was really saying there wasn't a kaiju on the loose, this is the location which the Rogue Jaeger came from, which happened to be in Siberia. And I found this misinterpretation of that icon to be really stupid, because when you really do look at the quote-unquote landmass within Siberia, it really does look like a side profile of a kaiju, because it does have a snout, rows of teeth, and a horn on its nose, but it's not. It's actually Siberian tundra from a bird's eye point of view. That just so happens to look like a side profile of a kaiju, and I just find that to be incredibly stupid. Oh yeah, and speaking of that kaiju database, another problem I had with the movie revolves around Stephen S. DeKnight's misunderstanding of Pacific Rim being an homage to the likes of various mech anime or giant monster movies. Because when Guillermo del Toro made the first Pacific Rim movie, he told a lot of his production team when designing the Jaegers, don't base it off a pre-existing giant robot, base it off a car. Or when it came to designing the kaiju, he said, don't base it off a pre-existing kaiju, base it off a real-life animal. Because he wanted the movie to stand on its own 2 feet, featuring original intellectual properties in which people could look at said Jaegers or kaiju, which might remind them of other giant robots or giant monsters, without directly referencing them. With this movie, on the other hand, Stephen S. DeKnight does exactly that. He does indeed make direct references to both pre-existing kaiju and mecha alike. Bringing up the kaiju database, for example, not only does it feature pre-existing kaiju from the previous Pacific Rim movie, he also makes references to several other kaiju from both the Godzilla franchise and the Gamera franchise. And sometime before the climax of the movie, we see one of the characters stand in front of a statue of the Unicorn Gundam from the Gundam franchise, which is both really distracting and defeats the purpose of an homage. Another problem I have with the movie is the concept behind the new recruits. Because I understand that within the context of this movie, it's been 10 years since the first movie, and the Jaeger program needs new Jaeger pilots, but did you really need to hire a bunch of teenagers? Like, it would have been one thing if the younger Jaeger recruits were in their early to mid-20s, I could understand that. But having a bunch of teenagers in the movie, I was just like, really? Like, at that point, we're basically entering Power Ranger and Neon Genesis Evangelion territory. And there are a few plot points that are never either fully explained or a plot point that retcons the continuity to the first movie. Like, how is it that no one knew about the creation of Obsidian Fury in terms of the labor force responsible for creating the Jaeger itself, along with someone funding money under the table to create it? Or why do Jake Pentecost and Nate Lambert have a problem with one another? Because there is a point in time where Jake Pentecost explains why the two of them are distant, and according to Jake, it was over something stupid. But the problem is, he just says it was over something stupid. We never learn what that stupid thing was. That makes these two characters have a shaky relationship. Then you have the kaiju blood, because in the previous Pacific Rim movie, it's established that the kaiju blood is toxic. Yet in this movie, one of the scientists discovers that the kaiju blood is actually really combustible. And here's the thing, if the kaiju blood is actually combustible, then why is it that when Gypsy Danger in the first Pacific Rim movie used its plasma cannon against kaiju like Knifehead or Leatherback, they didn't implode immediately? Because if the kaiju blood is indeed combustible, then Knifehead and Leatherback should have imploded immediately, but they didn't. Also, why do the Jaegers still exist within this universe? Because in the previous movie, it took place during the final days of the Kaiju War, and they only had so many Jaegers left because all the other Jaegers got destroyed over the course of the Kaiju War. And with this movie, the Kaiju War has been over for 10 years, yet there are Jaegers walking about in this post-Kaiju War era. Actually, if anything, there's a lot more Jaegers that show up in this movie than in the first Pacific Rim movie, and I really don't understand why there are Jaegers in this universe. Like, were they created in case more kaiju emerged? Because that can't be the case since they closed the portal in the other movie. But on the other hand, there are several people who took leftover Jaeger parts and made their own rogue Jaegers, and that could be a possibility, but that's not dived into further enough. It just feels like there's no real reason for these Jaegers to exist. Also, the biggest plot point that just doesn't add up to me is the fact that Jake Pentecost is the son of Stacker Pentecost. Because in the previous movie, Stacker never establishes at any point in time that he had a son. Because we, the audience, are led to assume that Mekomori is the only child he has. And even then, she's adopted. Yet here, the main character of Jake establishes the fact that he is the legit son of Stacker Pentecost. And if that's the case, why was he never mentioned in the previous movie? Like, it'd be one thing if Jake had no idea who his real father was, and then he gets into trouble. The police do a DNA test on him, and then the results come back, and it's discovered that he is the legit son of Stacker Pentecost. That'd be one thing, but within the context of the movie, it's established that he is indeed the legit son of Stacker Pentecost from the get-go. And my question is, if he is the legit son of Stacker Pentecost, where was he during the events of the previous Pacific Rim movie? And the biggest plot hole that retcons the first movie is the overall mission of the kaiju in this movie. Because in the first movie, when Newt dressed with a kaiju brain, he slowly learned about how they function, because it was believed that in the first movie, the kaiju randomly came out of the breach and mindlessly destroyed cities. No, the kaiju mindlessly destroying cities was actually not so mindless. It was actually a calculated move made on the precursors part, and it's established that they would send in more and more to a point where they send in this large platoon of kaiju to destroy all of Earth. Yet in this movie, they changed that around, where it turns out the kaiju weren't just destroying the major cities to take over Earth, but they're also destroying the cities so that they were able to get to Mount Fuji of all places? And this is a plot point, by the way, because the kaiju's mission in this movie is not to destroy a city, but to head to Mount Fuji as suicide bombers. And I ain't joking when I'm saying that neither. So yeah, I find the whole reason as to why the kaiju invaded this movie to be stupid. And speaking of Mount Fuji, in the context of the movie, it's shown that Mount Fuji is directly next to Tokyo in the movie, but in reality, Mount Fuji is nowhere near Tokyo. Like, to get an idea of how far away Tokyo is from Mount Fuji in real life, there's about 80 miles between Tokyo and Mount Fuji. So yeah, someone screwed up the geography in this movie. And the last problem that I had with the movie is when the three kaiju start to combine together to form the Mega-Kaiju. Because at this point in the movie, the main villain decides to unleash this swarm of nanomites heading straight towards the three kaiju to form the Mega-Kaiju. And as this is going on, our main heroes, who are in their Jaegers, are watching on the sidelines as the three kaiju merge together. And I'm sitting there going, they're really taking their time with this transformation sequence. I would think this would be a perfect opportunity to attack and end the kaiju threat while they're combining together. As it sits, our heroes do a stupid thing by letting the kaiju combine together to form the Mega-Kaiju, and get their asses whooped in the process. So, for my final verdict of Pacific Rim Uprising, the movie is an ambitious sequel that does one or two things a sequel should and shouldn't do. It takes the problems that people had with the first movie and corrects them. However, it creates just as many problems, because there is a bunch of cool ideas presented in this movie. It's just one of those things where the execution could have been a lot better. And on top of that, the movie is kind of your typical sequel in that sense of it might not be as good as the original, but I still think it is a fun movie to watch. So overall, Pacific Rim Uprising is an entertainingly okay movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Pacific Rim Uprising? Looks like the movie got generally negative reception. I mean, I'll admit, the movie's not as good as the original, but I really don't think the movie's that bad. And so, for my final rating of Pacific Rim Uprising, I'll give it a 3 out of 5. So, out of the Jaegers and or Kaiju that were featured in both the first Pacific Rim along with Pacific Rim Uprising, which one did you like the most? And see you later.